driver stopped to help a child. But when he got home, something terrifying was waiting. Chicago, a lively, bustling city, felt even colder and harsher on that rainy October night. The biting wind whipped through the dark streets, swirling dry leaves like little tornadoes across the wet pavement. Mia Anderson was exhausted. After a long day driving her cab, all she wanted was to go home, rest, and take care of her mom, whose health was getting worse every day. Her yellow cab crawled through the nearly empty streets, headlights catching the raindrops pounding against the windshield. She sighed, lost in thought, unaware of the problems waiting for her at home. Then, as she turned a corner, something unusual caught her eye. Standing alone on the sidewalk was a small figure. A girl, maybe no older than 10. Her clothes were soaked, and she clutched a backpack to her chest like it was the only thing she had in the world. Her blonde hair stuck to her face, wide eyes filled with fear and loneliness. Mia's heart sank. "What's a kid doing out here alone at this time?" she thought. Without hesitation, she pulled over to the curb and rolled down her window. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The girl looked at her with wide eyes, hesitating for a moment before shaking her head. A chill ran down Mia's spine. Something was terribly wrong. She couldn't just leave the girl there. "Come on, get in the car. I'll help you find your way home." The girl hesitated, but Mia's kind eyes encouraged her. Finally, she opened the door and sat in the back seat. Her body shook from the cold and fear. Up close, Mia noticed something strange. The girl was holding a crumpled drawing, detailed but worn. "What's your name?" Mia asked softly as she started driving again. "Sophie? Sophie Miller." Mia tried to keep the conversation light, but Sophie stayed distant, clutching her backpack like a shield. Something about the girl tugged at Mia. It wasn't just that she was alone. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, something she was hiding. As she drove, Mia couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was off. She decided to take Sophie home until she could figure out how to contact her parents or guardians. When they pulled up in front of Mia's small house in the quiet neighborhood, the dark clouds in the sky were starting to clear, but Mia knew the real storm was just beginning. As she walked inside with Sophie, Mia's phone buzzed. A message popped up. Unusual activity detected. It was a notification from her old security system. Her heart raced. Something else was going on. Mia walked into the house with Sophie close behind her. The small, cozy living room was dimly lit by a single lamp. The scent of old furniture, mixed with the faint aroma of chamomile tea, a soothing contrast to the damp cold outside. Mia's mother, Mrs. Anderson, was already asleep in her room, leaving the house unusually quiet. Sophie sat on the couch, her small hands still clutching her backpack like it was the only familiar thing left in the world. Mia took off her coat, hanging it near the door, and glanced at the girl. "You hungry?" Mia asked softly. Sophie nodded, her face still pale, her blue eyes filled with a quiet sadness. Mia smiled gently and made her way to the kitchen, pulling out some leftovers and heating them up. As she worked, her mind wandered to the strange notification from earlier. Sporadic activity detected. Her house had a basic security system, nothing fancy, just something she installed to feel safer living in the city. But it had never sent a message like that before. Sporadic activity? What did that even mean? As the microwave beeped, she brought a plate over to Sophie, who quietly thanked her and began to eat. Mia watched her, feeling a protective instinct growing inside her. There was something about this kid that tugged at her heartstrings. She had seen plenty of people in trouble through her years driving a taxi, but Sophie seemed different, vulnerable, but also hiding something deep. Mia sat across from her, trying to figure out how to approach the situation. "So, Sophie," Mia started cautiously, "you want to tell me what you were doing out there all alone?" The girl froze for a moment, her fork hovering over the food. She didn't meet Mia's eyes, instead staring at the plate in front of her. "I was waiting," Sophie whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "Waiting? For who?" Mia leaned in slightly. "For someone to find me." Mia frowned, her instincts flaring. This wasn't just a kid who got lost. Before she could push further, the sound of a car pulling up outside drew her attention. She got up, peeking through the window. A dark sedan sat idling at the curb, its headlights off. Mia's pulse quickened. Who would be outside at this hour? Suddenly, the same notification chimed again on her phone. Sporadic activity detected in living room area. She glanced around the room, eyes narrowing. Everything looked normal, except for the growing sense that something was very, very wrong. Turning back to Sophie, she asked firmly, "Is someone following you, Sophie?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear, but before she could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. Mia's heart skipped a beat. "Stay here," she whispered to Sophie as she walked slowly to the door, her mind racing. Should she call the police? Was it someone Sophie knew? She reached for the doorknob cautiously, but before opening, she glanced through the peephole. Standing on the other side was a man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by the dim streetlight. He knocked again, more impatiently this time. "Miss Anderson?" The voice was firm but not aggressive. Mia hesitated. How did this man know her name? Finally, after a deep breath, she opened the door just a crack. The man outside introduced himself, flashing a badge too quickly for her to get a good look. "Detective Tom Harris, Chicago PD," he said. "I'm looking for a girl, Sophie Miller. We believe she might be in danger." Mia's eyes darted to Sophie, sitting on the couch with fear written all over her face. "Why are you looking for her?" Mia asked, her voice tight with suspicion. The detective shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder before answering. "She's involved in something sensitive. It's important that I take her somewhere safe." Mia's instincts screamed at her. Something didn't add up. She hadn't known Sophie for more than an hour, but she wasn't about to just hand the girl over to a stranger, badge or not. "I think she's safer here for now," Mia replied, closing the door slightly more. "You can come back with a warrant." Detective Harris's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to the door, his voice lowering. "You don't understand, Miss Anderson. The people looking for her, they won't knock." The chilling words hung in the air as Mia's phone buzzed again. Another alert. Activity detected. Front door. Her blood ran cold. Mia's grip tightened on the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Every nerve in her body was on high alert. The detective's words echoed in her head. They won't knock. What kind of people were after Sophie? And why did a small girl like her seem caught up in something so dangerous? Behind her, Sophie sat frozen on the couch, her wide eyes locked on the door, as if expecting something terrible to burst through at any moment. Mia's instincts as both a caregiver to her ailing mother and as a driver who'd seen too much on the streets kicked in. She wasn't about to trust this stranger, not yet. But there was something about his presence that made her hesitate. "If Sophie's in that much danger," Mia said, voice steady despite her pounding heart, "then you need to explain more. I'm not handing her over without knowing what's going on." Detective Harris sighed heavily, lowering his head for a moment before looking back up, his face a mixture of frustration and urgency. "I get it, Miss Anderson. You're protective, and that's good. But you don't understand what's at stake here. Sophie's family? They were involved with some serious people. Her uncle's in deep, and she's a witness to something that can't fall into the wrong hands." Mia's eyes narrowed. Serious people? What did that even mean? Gangsters? Criminals? Or something more sinister? Before she could respond, Sophie spoke from behind, her voice trembling. "They're watching us, aren't they?" Both Mia and the detective turned to look at her. Sophie was clutching her backpack again, her face pale as a ghost. Mia walked over to her, crouching down so she was eye level with the girl. "Sophie, who's watching us? Do you know what's going on?" The little girl hesitated, glancing between Mia and Detective Harris, clearly struggling with how much she should reveal. Her hands trembled as she finally whispered, "It's not just them, it's everyone. I've seen things, heard things my uncle didn't think I would notice. There are people who can see through things, even when they're not there." Mia felt a cold chill run down her spine. What was this girl talking about? Surveillance? Spies? Sophie's voice dropped even lower. "I didn't mean to know, but now they're following me, and they want to take me away." Before Mia could process Sophie's cryptic words, Detective Harris stepped closer, his voice urgent but softened. "Listen, we need to move quickly. Whatever her uncle was mixed up in, it involves people with resources. High-tech surveillance? Connections that go deeper than local law enforcement. We think they're using the company her uncle worked for, Thompson Security, to track anyone with access to certain information." The name rang a bell. Mia had heard of Thompson Security. It was a well-known private firm that operated in the shadows of Chicago's elite. But why would they be interested in a 10-year-old girl? And why did they seem so determined to find her? Mia stood up and looked directly at Harris, suspicion still lingering but beginning to thaw slightly. "So what do you want with her? What's the police's angle in all this?" Harris ran a hand through his hair, clearly stressed. "My job is to protect her, plain and simple. We've been following her case ever since her uncle started leaking information to us about some shady operations inside Thompson Security. But now, everything's gone south. Her uncle disappeared, and Sophie is the only one left who might know what he was working on. She's a target, Mia, and so are you now." Mia's stomach twisted at the thought. She wasn't sure she fully believed him yet, but if even half of what he was saying was true, Sophie was in more danger than she'd realized, and so was she. She looked at the detective, her face hardening with resolve. "Fine, if you're really here to help, then prove it. Let me call your precinct, verify who you are. If this checks out, we'll figure out the next step." Harris nodded without hesitation. "Go ahead, call them." Mia grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she dialed the local precinct. A few tense minutes passed before a voice on the other end confirmed Harris's credentials. He was indeed a detective, and he'd been assigned to a case involving Thompson Security. But even with the confirmation, something still didn't sit right with Mia. When she hung up the phone, Harris met her gaze. "I told you I'm here to help, but we don't have much time." Just as he finished speaking, the security alert buzzed again on Mia's phone. This time, the message was different. "Multiple devices detected. Intrusion imminent." Mia's heart skipped a beat. Intrusion? She quickly pulled up the security camera feed from her front door, and her blood ran cold. Two shadowy figures stood just outside the range of the porch light, their faces hidden by the hoods of their jackets. One of them reached for something inside his coat. "We need to leave. Now," Harris said, urgency crackling in his voice as he glanced at Mia's phone. Mia rushed to Sophie, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her up from the couch. The fear in Sophie's eyes was unmistakable, but she didn't resist. They had to move fast. Harris was already at the door, his hand on the doorknob, when Mia's phone buzzed again. Unauthorized access detected at back entrance. Her heart raced as she realized they were surrounded. "There's no time," Harris barked. "We have to go out the front before they get inside." Without another second of hesitation, Mia grabbed her keys and Sophie's backpack. They pushed out the front door just as one of the men at the corner of the porch turned, his face partially illuminated by the streetlight. For a moment, their eyes met, cold, calculating, and relentless. Mia pulled Sophie close as Harris guided them quickly down the steps and into the waiting sedan parked near the curb. "Get in," Harris shouted, already starting the engine. As they sped off into the night, Mia's heart raced with a mixture of fear and confusion. She glanced back at Sophie, who was trembling but silent. Who were these people? And what had Sophie gotten herself into? More importantly, how was Mia now entangled in this dangerous web? As the city lights blurred outside the windows, one thing became clear. This was far from over. They were being hunted, and there was no telling who they could trust. The streets of Chicago blurred past as Harris's sedan raced through the city, headlights piercing the dark. Mia clutched Sophie tightly in the back seat, her mind spinning with questions and fear. Sophie's small body trembled, but her wide eyes remained glued to the road ahead, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any second. "Where are we going?" Mia demanded, her voice strained as she tried to steady herself. Harris's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his face tense but focused. "There's a safe house not far from here. We can regroup and figure out our next move. Right now, we need to stay ahead of them." "Them," Mia muttered, her grip on Sophie tightening. "Who exactly are they? You've said a lot of vague things, but I want answers, now." Harris hesitated, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. After a moment, he exhaled sharply. "Thompson Security. You've heard of them, right? Well, they're more than just some local security firm. They're involved in surveillance, private investigations, and more shady operations. Sophie's uncle got caught in something bigger than he could handle. He tried to expose it, but now they're after him, and anyone connected to him. That includes Sophie." "So why did you bring us to my house?" Mia asked, her anger rising. "You knew we were being watched." "I didn't have much of a choice," Harris replied, frustration seeping into his voice. "I needed to find Sophie before they did, and I didn't know how close they were until it was too late." The car sped around a corner, the tires screeching slightly on the wet pavement. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline still surging through her veins. This was madness. How had her life flipped upside down in just a matter of hours? A quiet night had turned into a nightmare. Sophie, who had been silent for most of the ride, finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my fault, isn't it?" Mia turned to her, her expression softening despite the chaos around them. "No, sweetie, it's not your fault." Sophie's lip trembled as she continued. "I heard my uncle talking about them. He was so scared. He said they could see everything we did, no matter where we were. He was trying to stop them, but he told me I had to run if anything happened to him." Mia's chest tightened as she pulled Sophie closer. "You're safe now, Sophie. We're gonna figure this out, okay?" Harris slowed the car as they approached an older industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The buildings were dark, abandoned for years, except for a single warehouse with a flickering light near the entrance. He pulled the car into a narrow alley behind the building and killed the engine. "We're here," he said, glancing around cautiously. "Stay close to me. If something goes wrong, you follow my lead. Understood?" Mia nodded, her pulse quickening again. This didn't feel like a safe house. It felt more like a trap. But what choice did they have? They were running out of options, and if Harris was right, those people would stop at nothing to get their hands on Sophie. As they stepped out of the car, the air felt colder, heavier. Mia kept Sophie close, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Harris led them toward the entrance of the warehouse, his posture tense. "How long can we stay here?" Mia asked, her voice low as they approached the door. "Not long," Harris replied. "Just until I can get back up. We need more than just the local police on this. These people have reach." Mia didn't like the sound of that. Just how deep did this conspiracy go? Harris reached for the door and began to push it open, when suddenly a faint clicking sound stopped him in his tracks. His eyes widened in alarm. "Get down!" he shouted, pulling Mia and Sophie to the ground, just as a spray of bullets ripped through the door, shattering the windows and ricocheting off the walls. Mia's ears rang as she shielded Sophie with her body, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. They had found them. "Move!" Harris yelled, yanking Mia to her feet and pushing them toward the far side of the alley. The three of them bolted down the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. Mia's mind raced, fear tightening her chest. Whoever these people were, they were deadly serious. They reached the end of the alley, where Harris pulled out his phone, frantically dialing a number as he pressed his back against the wall, scanning the street. "We're compromised," he hissed into the phone. "They've tracked us. I need immediate extraction." Mia leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Sophie clung to her, shaking but silent, her eyes wide with terror. They weren't safe anywhere. "Who are these people?" Mia asked again, her voice breaking. "Why are they after Sophie so badly?" Harris looked at her, his face pale under the dim light of a street lamp. "It's not just Sophie, Mia. It's what she knows. Her uncle was part of a project, something bigger than anyone thought. And now, she's the only one who can blow it wide open." "What project?" Mia asked, fear and frustration boiling over. Before Harris could answer, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A black SUV rounded the corner at breakneck speed, its headlights cutting through the night like a predator closing in on its prey. Mia's heart stopped. "Run!" Harris shouted. They took off again, the SUV gaining on them fast. But as they ran, Mia couldn't shake the growing dread that no matter how far they went, there was no escaping this web of shadows. The black SUV screeched toward them, headlights blinding in the darkness. Mia's pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped Sophie's hand tightly, running as fast as she could. Harris was ahead of them, scanning the area for cover. The alleyways were narrow, but they wouldn't outrun a vehicle for long. They needed to find somewhere to hide, fast. "Over here!" Harris shouted, pointing to an open doorway on the side of an abandoned building. Mia didn't think twice. She pulled Sophie toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Harris held it open, waving them through, just as the SUV roared down the alley behind them, its tires screeching as it braked sharply. The echo of heavy footsteps and slamming car doors rang through the air. They were coming. Harris slammed the door shut, throwing a bolt across it. The three of them stood in the dark, breathing hard. The building smelled of mold and dust, the air thick with decay. Sophie clung to Mia, trembling violently. Mia knelt, wrapping her arms around the girl, trying to calm her. But inside, Mia's own fear was spiraling. They were running out of options. They were trapped. "What now?" Mia whispered, her voice barely steady. Harris pulled out his phone, checking it quickly. "I've got backup on the way, but we've got to hold them off until then. This place won't keep them out for long." Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the door, the metal frame rattling as someone tried to force their way inside. Mia felt her stomach drop. How had they found them so quickly? Harris cursed under his breath, motioning for Mia to follow him deeper into the building. "We need to keep moving. They'll breach the door soon." The three of them navigated through the labyrinth of abandoned rooms and corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The building had once been a factory, long abandoned to the elements. Rusted machinery and forgotten crates cluttered the space, providing little comfort from the threat outside. Every shadow seemed to twist and move, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Mia's mind raced. "You still haven't told me what Sophie's uncle was involved in," she said, keeping her voice low. "If we're going to survive this, I need to know what we're up against." Harris glanced at Sophie, then back at Mia. His face was tense, but he nodded, finally realizing she deserved to know the full truth. "Thompson Security isn't just some private firm protecting the rich and powerful," he began, his voice grim. "They've been working on something far more dangerous, data manipulation. They've been gathering sensitive information on influential people across the country, politicians, CEOs, even law enforcement. But it's more than just blackmail." Mia's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Harris stopped for a second, listening to make sure they weren't being followed, then continued. "It's a system they've developed, called the Shadow Grid. It's an advanced surveillance network, capable of not just tracking people, but predicting their movements, manipulating digital records, altering identities. They can make people disappear, or worse, reappear as someone else entirely." Sophie's uncle was part of the team that helped build it. But when he realized how dangerous it was, how it could be weaponized, he tried to get out. That's when they came after him. Mia felt her stomach turn. "So, Sophie's uncle was going to expose them?" Harris nodded. He was planning to leak everything to the press. But before he could, they caught wind of it. He sent Sophie to stay with a relative, hoping she'd be safe while he tried to disappear. But he didn't count on them going after her, too. "She knows things, Mia, things her uncle told her without realizing. They can't let her live with that information." Sophie's small voice broke through the silence, trembling but determined. "I didn't mean to listen. I didn't know it was bad. But I heard him talking on the phone. He said they were going to use the grid to control people, to make them do things without even knowing." Mia knelt down, brushing Sophie's hair out of her face gently. "It's okay, sweetie. You did nothing wrong." But inside, Mia's fear deepened. This wasn't just about protecting Sophie anymore. This was about stopping a conspiracy that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. And now, because of her, they were all caught in the crossfire. Harris led them to a back room where the walls were reinforced with thick steel plating. The door creaked as he pulled it shut, locking them inside. "This should buy us some time," he said, though his voice carried little reassurance. Mia stood by the window, peering through a crack in the boarded-up glass. In the distance, she saw flashlights bobbing as figures moved through the alley. More vehicles had arrived. They were closing in. Her breath quickened. They were outnumbered, and the cavalry Harris had promised was nowhere in sight. "What if they break in before your backup gets here?" Mia asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Harris checked his watch, then his phone again. "They won't get in easily. This building used to be a military storage facility back in the day. There's a basement level that's even more secure. If we need to, we'll move down there. But my team should be here soon." Sophie clung to Mia's side, her face pressed against her arm. The child had been so brave, but Mia could see the terror in her eyes. She could feel the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. How had things escalated so quickly? She was just a taxi driver. How had she ended up caught in the middle of an international surveillance conspiracy? Another loud crash echoed from the front of the building. Someone was hammering against the entrance now, the sound of metal against metal reverberating through the walls. Harris cursed under his breath. "They're trying to break through. We don't have much time." Mia pulled Sophie tighter, her mind spinning. There had to be a way out of this. "What about that basement? Is there another exit down there?" Harris paused, then nodded. "There's an old service tunnel. It's risky, but it might be our only shot. If we can get through before they breach the building, we could get out without them knowing." "Then let's go," Mia said firmly, not willing to wait another second. Every instinct in her screamed that they had to move. Harris led them quickly down a narrow staircase that descended into the dark, cold depths of the building. The walls were damp and the air smelled stale, but Mia pressed on, keeping Sophie close. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy door marked the entrance to the service tunnel. Harris shoved it open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor stretching out ahead. "Stay close," he said, ushering them inside. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. Mia's heart raced as they moved further in, the sound of distant footsteps and banging fading behind them. For the first time in what felt like hours, Mia allowed herself to breathe. But then, just as they reached the midpoint of the tunnel, a sudden thud echoed ahead of them. Mia froze. "What was that?" Sophie whispered, her grip tightening on Mia's hand. Harris's face darkened. "They're here." They knew about the tunnel. Mia's heart sank. There really was no escape from these people. Mia's heart thudded in her chest as the echoes of the approaching footsteps filled the narrow tunnel. Sophie clung to her, trembling, while Harris cursed under his breath, pulling his gun from its holster. The tunnel walls seemed to close in on them, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows. There was nowhere left to run. The enemy was in front of them, and the way back was blocked. Harris signaled for Mia and Sophie to stay behind him, his face set in a grim determination. "No matter what happens, you two stick together and keep moving. If we make it through the tunnel, there's a service hatch that leads out to the street." Mia nodded, trying to keep her breathing steady, but deep down, fear clawed at her insides. This was it. No more running, no more hiding. The danger had caught up to them, and now they would have to face it head-on. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the darkness ahead, calm yet filled with menace. "There's no point in running anymore. You can't escape. We'll find the girl and we'll take what we need. Step aside, Harris." Mia's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It was calm, calculating, the same tone she'd heard from corporate types who thought they could control everything. Harris's eyes narrowed as he recognized the speaker too. "Thompson," Harris muttered under his breath. Mia felt a surge of anger. This was the man responsible for turning Sophie's life upside down. This was the man whose security firm was hunting them like animals. And now, he stood between them and their only hope for escape. The footsteps grew louder, and then, emerging from the shadows, a tall, sharp-dressed man appeared. Mr. Thompson. He was flanked by two men, both heavily armed, their eyes cold and unfeeling. Thompson's gaze zeroed in on Sophie, who instinctively stepped behind Mia, her small body shaking with fear. "Sophie," Thompson said smoothly, his voice soft yet dangerous. "You've been a difficult one to catch, but it ends here. Come with me, and no one has to get hurt." Mia stepped in front of Sophie, her body acting as a shield, her fury boiling over. "You're not taking her. She's just a kid. She doesn't have anything to do with whatever twisted plan you're running." Thompson's expression didn't waver. "You don't understand the situation, Miss Anderson. The child holds information, vital information, that could ruin a lot of powerful people. She's a risk we can't afford. Hand her over, and this can end peacefully." Harris raised his gun, his voice sharp. "The only thing ending tonight is your little operation, Thompson. We've got enough evidence to bury you and your whole crew. You're not getting near Sophie." Thompson's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing at Harris. "You think you can stop this? You're just a small piece of a much larger game. This goes beyond you." beyond anything you could imagine. We control more than just security, we control the future, and we can erase you like you never existed. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood firm. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her or take Sophie. They had come too far. Harris kept his gun trained on Thompson and his men, but Mia could see the tension in his eyes. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Any wrong move could be the end. Suddenly, Thompson raised his hand, signaling his men. One of them moved forward, aiming his weapon at Harris. Time seemed to slow. Mia's instincts screamed at her to do something, anything to stop them from taking Sophie. "Run!" Harris shouted, shoving Mia and Sophie toward the end of the tunnel. Without thinking, Mia grabbed Sophie's hand and sprinted toward the far end of the passage. She heard the sound of gunfire behind them, the deafening cracks echoing off the walls. Her heart hammered in her ears, her legs burning as she pushed forward with everything she had. She had to get Sophie out. There was no other option. The tunnel seemed endless, but then, up ahead, Mia spotted the service hatch Harris had mentioned. It was old, rusted, barely visible in the dim light. She grabbed the handle and pulled, the metal groaning under the strain, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she tugged harder, desperate to get the hatch open. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Thompson's men were coming. "Please," Mia whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled with all her strength. Finally, with a creak, the hatch gave way, opening just enough for them to squeeze through. "Go, Sophie," Mia urged, pushing the girl through the narrow opening. Sophie crawled out into the street, her small frame disappearing into the night. Mia followed, pulling herself through the hatch just as she heard another round of gunfire from behind. Her pulse raced as she scrambled to her feet, grabbing Sophie's hand again. They were outside now, in the middle of a deserted street on the edge of the industrial district. The cold night air stung Mia's lungs as she looked around frantically. There was no sign of Harris. "Come on," Mia urged, pulling Sophie along as they ran toward the nearest building. But just as they reached the edge of the street, headlights appeared from the darkness. Another black SUV roared around the corner, blocking their path. Mia's heart sank as Thompson's men emerged, weapons drawn, closing in on them. "It's over," Thompson's voice called out from behind, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he approached. "There's nowhere left to run, Miss Anderson." Mia's grip on Sophie tightened. She looked down at the little girl, fear and exhaustion etched into her face. She couldn't let this end here. She couldn't let them take Sophie. And then, in the distance, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of police sirens. Blue and red lights flashed at the end of the street, growing brighter by the second. Harris's backup. Thompson's calm demeanor finally cracked, his eyes darting to the approaching squad cars. He looked at Mia with a mixture of anger and regret. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Mia stood her ground, her chin raised defiantly. "No, you did, Thompson." The police vehicles skidded to a halt and officers poured out, guns drawn. Thompson's men froze, realizing they were outnumbered. Harris emerged from one of the cars, his clothes bloodied but alive, his gun still in hand. "It's over, Thompson," Harris called out. "You're done." Thompson's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with fury. He raised his hands slowly, signaling his men to do the same. The police swarmed them, disarming and cuffing the entire group. Mia collapsed to her knees, pulling Sophie into her arms, the relief crashing over her like a wave. They had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. Harris approached them, his expression softening as he looked at Sophie. "You okay, kid?" Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged Mia tightly. "Yeah, I think so." Mia looked up at Harris, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Thank you." Harris gave her a small, tired smile. "You were the one who kept her safe, Mia. You did good." As the chaos of the night finally began to fade, the three of them stood together under the flashing lights, a quiet sense of victory settling over them. Thompson and his men were taken away in handcuffs, their conspiracy finally exposed. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Mia knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just the end of a long night. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One where Sophie was safe, where the truth had been revealed, and where Mia had found a strength she never knew she had. So, curious to know what happened after Jake walked away at the altar? Why did he back out? Will they get a second chance? Don't miss the next chapter of this story full of twists. Click the video on your screen and find out what led Jake to make that shocking decision.